A lawsuit revealed the HOA had covered up $24,700 in noise complaints against a board member's business. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived in this neighborhood for more than 3 decades. When my wife and I first moved here, it was a quiet, modest place where everyone knew each other by name. I can still remember those early years, the sound of children riding their bikes down the street, neighbors stopping by to borrow sugar or to help carry groceries inside, families hosting block parties in the summer. Back then, we trusted one another. We trusted the board too. We believed they were there to keep things running smoothly, to handle the things the rest of us didn't have time to manage. Over the years, I've watched the community change. Some families moved away, new ones moved in. The trees we planted when the development was first built grew tall and wide, their roots pushing up through sidewalks that now need repair. But through it all, the one constant was the idea that the board existed to protect the neighborhood. They collected our dues, they enforced the rules, and they made decisions on behalf of all of us. We may not have always agreed with them, but we believed they were working in good faith. That belief, at least for me, has been shattered. It all began with whispers, the kind of quiet talk you overhear while walking your dog or standing at the mailbox. Someone mentioned a lawsuit had been filed against the Homeowners Association. At first, I didn't think much of it. HOAs get tangled in disputes from time to time. Maybe someone didn't agree with the fine. Maybe a vendor hadn't been paid on time. These things happen, and usually they fade away quickly. But this time was different. As the weeks passed, details began to trickle out. Neighbors shared what they had heard, and before long, the truth surfaced like something rotten that had been buried too long. The lawsuit revealed that the board had been covering up noise complaints, dozens of them, stretching back months, maybe even years. And these weren't just the usual complaints we all file now and then. These were about a business, loud, disruptive, impossible to ignore, that just so happened to be owned by one of our very own board members. Imagine that. People were calling, emailing, and submitting reports about the constant noise, the blaring music, the late-night disturbances. Families were losing sleep, children were waking up in tears, and yet every single one of those complaints disappeared, vanished, buried by the people we trusted to enforce the rules. And it didn't stop there. The most shocking part was what came next. The board didn't just ignore the complaints. They actively spent our money to shield their friend and fellow board member. When the lawsuit exposed the numbers, I nearly fell out of my chair. $24,700. That's how much of our community's money was, quietly poured into this cover-up. Money that should have gone to repairing broken sidewalks, resurfacing the pool, updating our playground equipment, or simply saving for emergencies. Instead, it went into protecting one man's business from the consequences of his own actions. When I read that figure for the first time, I thought back to all the times the board told us there wasn't enough in the budget. I thought about the meetings where homeowners asked for better lighting along the walking path and were told it was too expensive right now. I thought about the endless delays in repairing the pool, how we were told year after year that funds were too tight to make it a priority. I thought about the little things too, the peeling paint on the fences, the potholes in the parking lot, the weeds that grew taller each summer along the edges of our common areas. We were told there was no money for any of that. And yet, when it came to hiding noise complaints against one of their own, the board somehow found nearly $25,000. That was when the betrayal sank in. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. They chose to take our money we had no choice but to hand over each year, and use it to bury the truth. They didn't protect the community. They protected themselves. When the news spread, the neighborhood buzzed with anger and disbelief. I heard it at the park, at the mailbox, on the sidewalks in the evenings. People who had never raised their voices at a meeting were suddenly furious. They asked each other the same questions over and over. How long has this been going on? How much more have they hidden from us? And if they were willing to cover up complaints for a board member's business, what else were they willing to do? For me, and for many of my neighbors, this lawsuit didn't just reveal a financial scandal. It revealed the truth about the board itself. They weren't acting in our best interests. They weren't managing responsibly. They were looking out for themselves, and they were doing it with our money. That realization has changed everything. This was no longer just about noise. It was about trust, and trust, once broken, can never be put back the same way again. When the first wave of shock began to settle, something else took its place. Curiosity mixed with suspicion. We didn't just want to know that the board had covered things up. We wanted to know how. How could they hide so many complaints? How could they funnel away nearly $25,000 without a single one of us noticing? The lawsuit had cracked the door open. But now, as neighbors, we wanted to swing it wide. It started with conversations on the sidewalks. People who had never spoken more than a polite "good morning" began gathering in clusters, their voices lowered but urgent. I heard it when I walked my dog past the park. I heard it again standing at the mailbox when Mrs. Green leaned over and whispered, "I filed 3 complaints myself, Richard." 3. Not one of them shows up anywhere in the records. It's like they vanished. She wasn't alone. Dozens of neighbors had the same story. They had sent emails, made phone calls, even filled out the official complaint forms on the HOA's website, and every time, the responses were the same. Vague promises, polite deflections, or complete silence. Now we know why. Those complaints had never made it into the official log. They had been intercepted, erased, or filed under categories that meant nothing. The lawsuit laid it bare. There were entire batches of emails that never made it into the public record. Whole conversations between homeowners and the board disappeared, as if they had never existed. Instead, the board labeled them with terms like administrative closure, inquiry resolved, or informal discussion. None of those phrases meant anything. They were just shields, carefully chosen words to make paperwork look tidy while complaints were quietly buried. I remember one evening, sitting on the porch with my neighbor, Mrs. Franklin. She's lived here almost as long as I have. She leaned close, her voice trembling, and said, "Richard, last summer I called them at least 5 times. My grandkids couldn't even nap when they visited because of that noise. Every time they told me not to worry, that it was being handled. Now I realize it wasn't being handled at all. It was hidden." The pain in her voice told me she wasn't just angry. She felt deceived, betrayed. The more we talked to each other, the clearer the pattern became. People who had been dismissed at meetings now saw the truth that their words had never been written down in the minutes, or, if they were stripped of any detail. Complaints that should have been front and center were shuffled into footnotes or erased entirely. And the money told its own story. Neighbors began digging through old financial reports. At first glance, everything looked like normal columns of expenses, categories we'd seen 100 times. But when you looked closer, you could see it. Hidden in the fine print, buried under phrases like consulting fees, administrative processing, and special services, were the payouts. Little by little, they added up. Hundreds here, a couple thousand there. Over months, the total grew to $24,700. Not spent on playground equipment, not on repairing the pool or fixing the sidewalks, but on shielding one board member's business from the very rules the rest of us were forced to follow. And what stung the most was realizing this wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was deliberate. It took planning. Minutes were edited before being posted online. Financial records were padded with vague language. Reports were distributed late, giving homeowners no chance to question them before the next cycle. It was like watching a magician's trick in slow motion. You could see the sleight of hand now, plain as day. One night, my neighbor Mark, who's an accountant, came over with a thick binder under his arm. He sat at my kitchen table, flipping through pages highlighted in yellow. "Richard," he said, "look at this." Line after line, buried in the budget under nonsense categories. This isn't just about noise complaints. If they were willing to manipulate the books for this, imagine what else is hiding in here. His words sent a chill through me, because he was right. We had uncovered one rotten floorboard, but who knew how deep the rot really went? The neighborhood began to change in small but noticeable ways. People started organizing impromptu meetings in garages and living rooms, bringing copies of old emails, minutes, and budgets. We compared notes. We pieced together timelines. And each time we discovered another missing complaint, another suspicious expense, the outrage grew sharper. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about trust, about dignity, about the simple expectation that the rules applied to everyone equally, including board members. They had told us to tighten our belts when budgets were thin. They had told us there was no money for repairs or improvements. But when it came to protecting one of their own, suddenly there was a bottomless well of cash. By the end of that month, the whispers had turned into something louder. People no longer lowered their voices. They talked openly about betrayal at the grocery store, about corruption in the parking lot, about deception while walking their dogs. The board had wanted silence, but what they created instead was a community that had found its voice. For the first time in years, neighbors were united not by frustration with one another, but by a common cause. And deep down, I knew the board had underestimated us. They thought we were too distracted, too passive, too trusting to question them. But now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. The night of the board meeting arrived like a storm everyone could see coming. For weeks, the neighborhood had been buzzing, a constant hum of anger and anticipation. Normally, attendance at these meetings was sparse, maybe a dozen homeowners scattered in folding chairs, politely sipping coffee. But that night, the room was packed. Every chair was filled, people lined the walls, and a few stood shoulder to shoulder near the back. The air was thick with tension, the kind you could feel before a thunderclap. I sat near the middle, close enough to see the board members' faces. They looked uncomfortable from the moment they walked in. Usually they carried themselves with a certain smug ease, like they were used to ruling without resistance. But this time, they shuffled papers nervously, avoided eye contact, and whispered to one another. They knew. They knew the crowd wasn't here to listen quietly. The meeting began, the same as always. Roll call. Approval of minutes, but the usual rhythm faltered. Each item felt forced, like the board was stalling, desperate to get through the agenda before the storm broke. Then came the open forum, the part of the night where homeowners could stand up and speak. That's when everything changed. Mrs. Green was the first to rise. Her voice shook at first, but it grew steadier as she spoke. 3 times, she said, holding up her fingers for all to see. I filed 3 separate noise complaints. Each time I was told it would be addressed. Each time I was reassured the board was handling it. Now I know the truth. Those complaints never made it to the record. They were buried, erased, lied about. And I want to know why. A murmur rippled through the crowd, people nodding, whispering. The board president, mister? Holloway cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers. We can't discuss ongoing litigation, he said quickly, his voice clipped. It's a matter before the courts, and our attorney has advised us. But he didn't get far. Mark, the accountant neighbor, stood up next, binder in hand. His voice boomed across the room. Don't hide behind legal jargon. Don't tell us what you can't discuss. We are your neighbors. We are the people who pay these dues. And I've gone through the numbers, every line. $24,700 siphoned off under fake categories. Not for maintenance, not for improvements, but for shielding one of your own from accountability. Do you think we're blind? Do you think we're fools? The crowd erupted in applause, some clapping, others shouting, "That's right!" The board members exchanged nervous glances, their composure cracking under the pressure. Mr. Holloway tried again, his tone sharp now, almost scolding. These accusations are unfounded. The financial reports were properly approved, and all expenditures were in line with association policy. That was the wrong thing to say. Immediately, hands shot up, voices overlapped. Mrs. Franklin, her frail frame steady with determination, called out from the third row. Policy? Policy says we can't leave our trash cans out a day too long without a fine. Policy says we have to beg for months to get a crack in the sidewalk fixed. But policy apparently has no problem with $24,000 vanishing into thin air. Her words cut like a knife, and the room roared with agreement. People weren't just asking questions anymore. They were demanding answers. Some stood up in their seats, shouting over the board's attempts to regain control. One man near the back raised his voice above the noise. If any of us broke a rule, you'd be on us in an instant. But when it's your buddy's business causing problems, suddenly the rules don't apply. We deserve to know the truth. The board tried to gavel the room into silence, but the sound of wood striking metal was swallowed by the chorus of voices. It was chaos, but beneath the chaos was something new, a collective strength. For the first time, the board wasn't in control. The homeowners were. Finally, Mark slammed his binder down on the table in front of the board, the sound echoing through the room. If you won't answer us here, then answer us in court. Because this community is done being silent. You owe us every dollar, every explanation, every apology, and we're not going away. The board members sat frozen, their faces pale. They had built their power on the assumption that neighbors wouldn't pay attention, wouldn't question, wouldn't care enough to dig. But now the veil was lifted, and there was no hiding anymore. The meeting ended not with the board's usual tidy wrap-up, but with shouting, chanting, and the unmistakable feeling that the balance of power had shifted. As we spilled into the parking lot, neighbors stayed clustered in groups, talking animatedly, planning the next steps, lawsuits, recalls, petitions. It was all on the table. And as I stood there among them, I realized something. The board had tried to silence complaints, but instead, they had awakened a neighborhood that finally found its voice. The cover-up was crumbling, and now it was only a matter of time before the whole truth came out. When the meeting finally broke apart, the board members left in a rush, avoiding eye contact as if the crowd might swallow them whole. They shuffled their papers into briefcases, their faces stiff, and slipped out through the side door. It was obvious they weren't heading home to sleep peacefully. They were heading somewhere to regroup, to strategize, to figure out how to contain the fire that had just erupted. And sure enough, within days, word spread that the board had held an emergency session. Not the kind open to homeowners, but a closed-door meeting. No notice was given, no agenda posted. Just whispers that the board members had gathered late into the night at the president's house, lights burning, long past midnight. Neighbors walking their dogs saw cars parked along the street and heard muffled voices through drawn curtains. Inside that living room, the atmosphere was nothing like the confidence they once displayed at the clubhouse. The mood was tense, defensive. Mr. Holloway, the president, paced the floor while others sat stiffly in armchairs. One board member rubbed his temples, muttering about lawsuits. Another snapped that the community had been riled up by rumors. They argued about strategy, whether to deny everything outright, to blame the treasurer, to hide behind legal language. But no matter how they twisted it, one truth sat like a stone in the room. The documents existed. The money trail was undeniable. And worse, the homeowners weren't backing down. For the first time, the board wasn't dealing with scattered complaints or a single frustrated resident. They were facing an entire neighborhood that had woken up. Meanwhile, the community was anything but quiet. The very next day, flyers appeared, slipped under doorsteps, and taped to mailbox stands. Bold letters across the top read, "Where did our $24,700 go?" Inside was a summary of the lawsuit, the noise complaints, and the cover-up. At the bottom, in large letters, "Join us. Speak out. Demand accountability." It was clear the neighbors weren't waiting for the board to come clean. They were organizing themselves. Small groups began gathering in living rooms and garages, turning ordinary homes into strategy centers. Long folding tables were covered in financial statements, copies of bylaws, even printouts of emails some residents had managed to obtain. People who had never spoken much beyond polite waves at the mailbox were now huddled together, brainstorming, comparing notes, planning next steps. Retired accountants, lawyers, and longtime residents each took on roles digging through budgets, drafting letters, advising on legal options. The sense of betrayal had forged something new: unity. Of course, the board wasn't blind to this. Rumors swirled that they were drafting a statement to clarify the situation. Some claimed the treasurer had been told to prepare a corrected financial report, one that would make the money appear as though it had been allocated differently, buried under categories like community outreach or event management. Others said they were hiring a public relations consultant to coach them on how to handle angry homeowners. But every attempt they made to spin the story only seemed to fuel the fire. When the clarified report was finally posted on the HOA website, it raised more questions than answers. Suddenly, vague line items like administrative expenses ballooned into the tens of thousands. Neighbors printed copies and circled the numbers in red ink, passing them around at block gatherings. "They think we're too stupid to notice," one resident muttered. "They're just moving numbers around." The board's panic was showing. Instead of silencing the community, their fumbling only deepened the distrust. And while they scrambled behind closed doors, homeowners grew. Louder, bolder. Petitions circulated demanding the removal of specific board members. Neighbors talked about forming an independent audit committee. One evening, a group of residents even stood outside the board president's house with signs, not yelling, not rioting, just standing in the dark, holding posters that read, "Answer us. Where's our money? We deserve the truth." From behind his curtains, Mr. Holloway peeked out, his face pale. He pulled the drapes shut quickly, but it was too late. Everyone saw him. And in that moment, one thing became clear. The board was no longer the authority in the neighborhood. The homeowners were. What had started as whispers and quiet suspicion had grown into a movement. And the board, no matter how they schemed, couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. The truth was coming, and no luxury event, no altered report, no late-night meeting could stop it. The first court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, but by the time the sun rose, people were already gathering outside the courthouse. Some carried manila folders stuffed with paperwork, others held coffee cups as they huddled in groups, whispering, pointing, waiting. Word had spread through the community like wildfire. The lawsuit that exposed the board's cover-up was finally being heard. Normally, only a handful of residents would take time off work for something like this, but this time was different. Dozens showed up. Retirees who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, parents with strollers, young professionals who rearranged their schedules just to be there. For once, the divide between generations, between long-timers and newcomers, had vanished. Everyone was united in one cause: accountability. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even heavier than at the stormy HOA meeting weeks before. Rows of wooden benches filled with neighbors leaned forward, listening intently as attorneys spoke in sharp, clipped voices. The plaintiff's lawyer laid out the story plainly. $24,700 in noise complaints, quietly paid off, never disclosed, hidden from homeowners. This money was not used for the community, he said firmly, pausing to let the words hang. It was used to protect one individual, a sitting board member, at the expense of everyone else. Across the aisle, the board's attorney shifted uncomfortably, clutching his notes. His defense was weak, filled with phrases like procedural misunderstanding and clerical error. But the judge's raised eyebrows made it clear those excuses weren't landing. Neighbors exchanged glances, nodding silently. They could see it. The board's facade of control was cracking. But the courtroom wasn't the only place the story lived. By that afternoon, local news stations had picked it up. Cameras appeared on sidewalks, reporters knocked on doors, asking residents for comments. A headline flashed across the evening broadcast: Neighborhood HOA accused of $24,700 cover-up. Suddenly, what had been a private neighborhood scandal became public. And once it was public, there was no going back. The community reacted in waves. Some felt vindicated finally, the truth was out for everyone to see. Others felt anger sharpen into determination. Meetings in garages turned into organized strategy sessions, with committees forming, one group drafting recall petitions, another gathering signatures, another reaching out to city officials, demanding oversight. Meanwhile, inside the board itself, the pressure was mounting. Whispers circulated that not everyone on the board had agreed to the cover-up. One member, a younger man who had joined only last year, was seen leaving the courthouse looking shaken. Rumors spread that he had been cut out of the decision-making process and was now considering resigning and possibly testifying. The unity the board once displayed in public was unraveling. Where they used to sit side by side at meetings, exchanging confident nods, now they barely looked at each other. Their emails, leaked by someone on the inside, revealed infighting, accusations, finger-pointing, desperate pleas to get the story straight before the next hearing. But it was too late. The cracks had become canyons. One evening, I walked down the main street of our neighborhood and saw clusters of people outside on their lawns, neighbors talking with neighbors in a way I hadn't seen in years. There was a sense of shared purpose, a recognition that this wasn't just about money, it was about trust, fairness, and the future of the place we called home. As for the board, they retreated further into secrecy. Their once monthly newsletters became thin, vague, avoiding details. They stopped answering homeowner emails altogether. Some stopped showing up in public spaces, no longer walking their dogs in the park, no longer stopping to chat at the pool. They were prisoners of their own decisions, isolated in the very neighborhood they were supposed to serve. And yet, the louder their silence grew, the louder the community's voice became. Petition sheets filled up faster than expected. Yard signs began appearing. Recall the board. Our money, our voices. We deserve better. The lawsuit was only the beginning. The legal process would drag on for months, maybe longer. But already, the board was losing in a much bigger way. They had lost the trust of the people. And once trust is broken, no courtroom victory could ever repair it. In the weeks that followed the first court hearing, something remarkable began to happen. What had once been a sleepy neighborhood, where most people barely glanced at HOA newsletters, turned into a hub of activity. You could feel the shift everywhere on sidewalks, at the playground, even at the little coffee shop just outside the subdivision. Conversations that used to be about weather or weekend plans now centered around one thing: the board, the lawsuit, and what the community was going to do about it. The recall effort started quietly, almost cautiously. A few neighbors gathered around a dining room table, papers spread out, laptops open. They researched the bylaws, studied the exact steps required to remove sitting board members, and mapped out a plan. They knew the process would be tedious, designed to favor those in power. But they also knew they weren't alone anymore. Soon, clipboards were circulating. Petition sheets were passed from hand to hand, at block parties, play dates, and even during morning jogs. Retired neighbors took to knocking on doors, politely explaining the situation, handing over copies of financial records, and asking for signatures. Younger families spread the word through group chats and social media pages, sharing updates and rallying support. Within a week, the required number of signatures wasn't just met, it was exceeded by dozens. Meanwhile, the homeowners began hosting their own meetings, separate from the board. These gatherings were far different from the stiff, formal HOA sessions. They were held in living rooms, garages, and sometimes outside in the open air. Children played nearby while adults pulled up folding chairs, drank coffee, and discussed strategy. Neighbors who had never spoken beyond a wave were now bonded by purpose. They drafted open letters, coordinated media outreach, and even pooled small donations to cover legal fees. At one such meeting, an elderly resident stood up. Her voice trembled, but it carried strength. "I've lived here 30 years, she said. I've seen boards come and go, but never in my life have I seen a group betray us so deeply. This is not about politics or power anymore. This is about trust. And once trust is broken, it cannot be mended unless there is change." Her words were met with loud applause, not polite clapping, but the kind that comes from shared conviction. While the community grew louder and more organized, the board grew quieter. They retreated into silence, their once bold monthly updates shrinking into vague paragraphs filled with platitudes. They stopped holding office hours. Emails from homeowners went unanswered. When board members were spotted in the neighborhood, they looked nervous, keeping their heads down, avoiding conversation. A few even hired lawyers of their own, worried about being personally implicated. But the more they tried to hide, the more suspicious they looked. The tension came to a head when neighbors organized a people's meeting in the park. Dozens showed up with lawn chairs and coolers. Someone set up a microphone. One by one, residents stood up to speak not in anger, but in resolve. They told stories of ignored repair requests, unexplained fees, and unanswered complaints. They spoke of how the $24,700 wasn't just money, it was a symbol of the board's contempt for the very people they were supposed to serve. The energy that day was electric. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was determination. Parents talked about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to raise their kids in. Retirees talked about fairness, about leaving something better for the next generation of homeowners. Every voice, no matter how different, came together under the same message: enough was enough. By the end of the gathering, volunteers were already coordinating the logistics for a recall vote. Others were drafting proposals for stricter financial oversight, independent audits, and greater transparency. What had once been a passive, divided group of homeowners was now a movement. And as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the park, it became clear the board was losing its grip. The people they thought would never notice, never question, never fight back had risen up. And this time, they weren't going to stop until real change came. Behind the closed doors of the board's meetings, the cracks had become chasms. What once looked like a unified front was now a group of anxious, bickering individuals scrambling to save themselves. Emails leaked into the neighborhood's hands showed arguments that bordered on desperation. One board member accused another of failing to handle the books properly. Another shot back that the president had pressured everyone into silence. The treasurer, whose signature appeared on most of the disputed financial records, especially cornered neighbors, whispered that he hadn't been seen in public for weeks, too ashamed or too frightened to face anyone. The pressure grew unbearable when one member, a younger man named Daniel, suddenly resigned. His letter, terse but cutting, spread like wildfire once it reached the community. In it, he wrote, "I cannot, in good conscience, continue to serve on a board that misleads its residents, ignores their voices, and hides financial misconduct. The homeowners deserve better." That letter landed like a bombshell. It confirmed what everyone suspected. The corruption wasn't just rumor. One of their own had broken ranks, and his words carried weight. The homeowners read the letter aloud at gatherings, printed it in flyers, shared it in online groups. The narrative had shifted. The board wasn't just embattled. They were imploding from within. Meanwhile, the recall movement surged ahead. Volunteers worked late into the night, tallying signatures, cross-checking names, making sure no detail could be contested. It was more than a petition now. It was a declaration of independence from a board that had betrayed its own community. And the board knew it. You could see it in their eyes at the next official HOA meeting. Only half the members showed up, their chairs conspicuously empty. The ones who remained sat stiff, voices shaky, trying to plow through the agenda as though nothing was wrong. But the homeowners in attendance wouldn't let them. Every vague answer was met with sharp questions. Every deflection was countered with documented proof. The balance of power in that room had shifted permanently. The president, Mr. Holloway, who once commanded meetings with smug confidence, looked like a man cornered. He raised his voice more often, slammed his gavel harder, but each outburst only made him look weaker. His words fell flat against the rising tide of unity in the room. And behind the scenes, paranoia set in. Whispers said that some board members had begun secretly contacting attorneys, not for the HOA, but for themselves, worried about being named personally in lawsuits. Others were calling realtors, quietly preparing to sell their homes and leave before things got worse. The fracture widened when another member, long regarded as one of the president's allies, was overheard privately telling a neighbor she regretted ever signing off on those payments. That neighbor told another, and soon the whole community knew. Trust among the board had disintegrated completely. They no longer strategized together. They accused, deflected, and scrambled to protect themselves. Meanwhile, the recall date loomed closer. Lawn signs sprouted up like spring weeds. Yes to recall? Take back our HOA. No more secrets? Some residents even painted slogans on poster boards and taped them inside their windows, visible from the street. The neighborhood, once quiet and divided, now pulsed with solidarity. For the first time, it was the board members who felt outnumbered in their own community. When they drove down the streets, they saw signs calling for their removal. When they walked their dogs, people turned their heads or muttered under their breath. They were strangers in the very place they claimed to govern. And yet, in their desperation, they still tried one last tactic. Intimidation. Anonymous letters appeared in a few homeowners' mailboxes, warning that legal fees would skyrocket if the recall went forward, hinting at special assessments to cover costs. But instead of scaring people, those letters enraged them further. "They're threatening us with our own money," one homeowner said at a gathering. "This is exactly why they need to go." The board was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and arrogance. One resignation had already happened, and more seemed inevitable. The community wasn't just pushing for change anymore. They were demanding it, organized, united, unstoppable. As I stood in the back of that crowded meeting room, watching the board flounder while my neighbors stood taller than I'd ever seen them, I realized something. This wasn't just about removing a few corrupt officials. This was about rewriting the story of our neighborhood. And the old chapter, the one ruled by secrecy and self-interest, was finally coming to an end. The night of the recall vote was unlike anything our neighborhood had ever seen. For years, HOA meetings had been routine, almost sleepy affairs. But this time, the community center looked like the heart of a small-town election night. Cars lined both sides of the street, headlights cutting through the dusk as families arrived in waves. People carried folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, even clipboards. By the time the doors opened, the line stretched out into the parking lot. Inside, the room buzzed with anticipation. Homeowners who had once been strangers now greeted each other with nods and handshakes, united by weeks of late-night meetings and door-to-door petitions. Some wore pins they had made themselves with slogans like, "Our voices matter," and "Accountability now." Others carried manila folders, ready with notes and copies of bylaws should anyone try to twist the rules. At the front sat the board, or what was left of it. Only 3 members remained, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The president, Mr. Holloway, tried to project confidence, but his eyes darted nervously across the crowd. Every gavel strike echoed like a plea for control he no longer possessed. The recall process was supposed to be simple. Homeowners would cast their votes, yes or no, to remove the current board, and the results would be tallied. But nothing about the night felt simple. The atmosphere was electric, tense, almost theatrical. Every motion, every word seemed to carry the weight of years of frustration and betrayal. Neighbors whispered in small clusters as ballots were handed out. Parents hushed their children. Retirees adjusted their glasses. Young couples filled out their forms with steady hands. You could almost hear the pens scratching across paper, the silence of decision-making. For some, it was a symbolic act of reclaiming power. For others, it was a demand for justice. The board sat stiffly at the front table, forced to watch as one homeowner after another lined up to submit their ballots. Their faces betrayed everything: fear, resentment, exhaustion. Mr. Holloway's hand tapped impatiently against the table, his knuckles white. When the last ballot was dropped into the box, the room grew quiet. Volunteers, chosen by the community, carried the box to a long table where the counting would begin. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes fixed, every number called out like a drumbeat. 10 votes for recall. 21 votes for recall. 34 votes for recall. Each tally built like a wave, rolling higher, louder. Applause broke out in bursts, then hushed again as the count continued. The board sat frozen, their bodies stiff, their gazes fixed on the table as though willing the numbers to change. When the final total was read aloud, the room erupted. The majority was overwhelmingly far more than needed to remove the board. Cheers filled the air, people hugging, clapping, even wiping away tears. For a community that had been divided, ignored, and silenced for so long, this was not just a victory. It was liberation. Meanwhile, the board members sat in stunned silence. Mr. Holloway tried to speak, to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. His gavel struck the table one last time, but it was a hollow sound, empty of authority. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, shoved them into a leather folder, and left without another word. The others followed, their footsteps echoing against the tile floor as they slipped into the night, shadows fading into irrelevance. In their place, the community stood taller than ever. Neighbors who had once felt powerless now realized the truth. They were the HOA. The dues, the decisions, the power, it all belonged to them, not to a handful of people behind closed doors. The recall vote didn't just remove corrupt leaders. It ignited something far more powerful, a sense of ownership, of unity, of resolve. And as the celebration spilled into the parking lot, with neighbors shaking hands, sharing laughter, and talking about what came next, there was no doubt this was a turning point. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't in the hands of the few. It was in the hands of the many. The recall election was over, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood woke up with a sense of relief. The air felt lighter, as if the whole community had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months greeted each other at their mailboxes. Children rode bikes down the sidewalks without the usual shadow of their parents' whispered complaints in the background. It wasn't just the removal of a board. It was the removal of a weight that had hung over everyone for too long. But if the recall was the victory, the real work was only just beginning. The next Saturday, a meeting was called at the community center, not by the old board, not by any official leader, but by the homeowners themselves. This time, there was no long table at the front of the room, no chairs placed in rows, like an audience before a stage. Instead, the chairs were arranged in a circle, a small but symbolic change. It meant no one was above anyone else anymore. Mrs. Ortega, one of the residents who had been among the loudest voices for accountability, was the first to speak. Her tone carried both hope and caution. We did something incredible. We proved that when we stand together, we can hold anyone accountable. But this is just step one. Now we have to rebuild. We have to decide how this community will move forward, and it has to be different from the way it was before. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. Tom Reynolds, a young father who had often been quiet at past meetings, raised his hand. We should broadcast every meeting from now on. No more excuses about people not being able to attend. If you can't make it in person, you should still be able to log in and see exactly what's happening. Heads nodded. Someone else added, and we need real financial reports. Not those vague annual letters they used to send out. I'm talking about line by line. Who got paid, for what, and how much. Posted online every single month exactly, said another homeowner. If we had those reports before, they never could have hidden $20,000 for some so-called luxury event. The ideas kept coming. Open records, term limits for board members, mandatory homeowner approval for any expense over a set amount, rotating committees so no single person held control over finances or contracts for too long. People spoke with a kind of urgency, like a dam had burst and the flood of frustration was finally pouring out. But not everyone was convinced this new energy would last. What if we can't keep it up? Asked an older resident named Henry, his arms crossed. It's easy to get fired up now, but serving on a board takes time. People have jobs, families, obligations. That's why we ended up in this mess before, because only a handful of people were willing to do the work, and they ended up running everything. The room fell silent for a moment. His words hung heavy in the air, because there was truth in them. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. I'll help, said Maria, a single mother who had never spoken up in previous meetings. I can't serve full-time, but I can run the neighborhood website. I can make sure documents are posted. I'll take finances, said Roger, a retired accountant. I spent 40 years balancing books for businesses. I've seen what fraud looks like, and I won't let it happen here again. I'll organize elections, said Kevin, a neighbor who had spent years complaining about secrecy. No more locked boxes or mystery ballots. We'll do this right. It was slow, hesitant at first, but by the end of the meeting, a slate of interim leaders had formed, not appointed in back rooms, but chosen openly, by show of hands, right there in the circle. Applause broke out, not for individuals, but for the process itself. Yet, even in this moment of progress, the shadows of the old board still lingered. Just days later, anonymous flyers began to appear in mailboxes. The pages accused the new leaders of being unqualified and driven by emotion, claiming that the recall had been a mistake. Without experienced leadership, the flyer warned, the neighborhood will collapse. No one had to guess where it came from. The language was all too familiar. But instead of dividing people, the flyers only strengthened their resolve. At the next gathering, neighbors brought the leaflets with them, waving them in the air. Do they really think we're this gullible? Someone asked. We saw the receipts. We know exactly where our money went. They're scared, another replied. Scared because they've lost their grip. And they should be. What happened next shook the community even more. The new interim treasurer, Roger the retired accountant, had begun an informal audit. He sat hunched over old ledgers and bank records for hours, poring through line after line of numbers. At the following meeting, he presented what he found. Receipts for catering and entertainment, limousine rentals, thousands of dollars in consulting fees with no documentation, a staggering $2,300 bar tab, all filed under vague categories like community development and maintenance. Every line item revealed another layer of betrayal. The room grew restless as Roger spoke, papers shuffling, gasps cutting through the air. One woman whispered, "We've been paying for their parties while my roof leaks." Another muttered, "They called this community service?" The anger wasn't just loud, it was focused. "No more," said Mrs. Ortega, her voice trembling with conviction. "From this day forward, not $1 will be spent without this community knowing exactly where it's going." She slammed her hand on the table for emphasis, and the room erupted with applause. Still, rebuilding wasn't easy. Disagreements broke out over priorities. Some wanted to fix the sidewalks first. Others pushed for the pool. Arguments flared, voices rising, hands waving. But unlike before, these arguments didn't end in secrecy. They were in the open, transparent, where everyone could see. And when tempers cooled, progress was made. For the first time, meetings didn't feel like battlegrounds. They felt like something else entirely. Children sat in the back with coloring books while their parents debated budgets. Elderly neighbors brought trays of cookies, offering them during breaks. Conversations spilled into the parking lot afterward, not with bitterness, but with cautious optimism. The old board members tried to insert themselves now and then, but their words carried no weight. They had lost the trust of the community, and in neighborhoods like this, trust was everything. What replaced it was stronger. Not perfect, not free of conflict, but real. For the first time in years, the homeowners weren't just people who lived near each other. They were partners, united by the hard truth that they nearly lost their community to greed and determined never to let it happen again. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't just look like home. It felt like home. The weeks after the recall felt surreal. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for years seemed to dissipate overnight, replaced by an energy that was both tangible and almost electric. For the first time, homeowners truly felt like they had a voice that mattered, and they were determined to use it. The new interim board moved quickly, but carefully. Their first order of business was transparency. Every financial record from the previous board was posted online for all to see, along with explanations for every line item. Receipts for the $24,700 luxury event were laid bare, and the community saw, in stark detail, the extravagant dinners, cocktails, and limousine rides that had been paid for with funds that were meant for repairs and maintenance. Anger swelled at first, but it quickly turned into resolve. People weren't just upset, they were motivated. Next came the tangible work, the repairs. Sidewalks that had been cracked for years were scheduled for immediate replacement. The pool, which had been closed for months due to safety violations, was repaired, resurfaced, and reopened. Landscaping crews, now vetted through multiple bids and overseen by a committee of homeowners, planted new trees, shrubs, and flowers. Every project was documented, photographed, and shared with the community, ensuring no corner could be cut and no dollar misused. Homeowners themselves became involved in ways they had never imagined. Residents volunteered to clean common areas, organize neighborhood watch programs, and even host community improvement days. Families brought kids, paintbrushes, gloves, and rakes. Retirees lent their experience and guidance. Young adults brought energy and ideas, sometimes coordinating entire teams for projects that the old board had only talked about in meetings that no one ever understood. At one community meeting, Mrs. Ortega addressed the room, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and humility. "We've taken our neighborhood back," she said, "not because one person stood up, not because a few voices shouted the loudest, but because every single one of you chose to care, to act, to demand accountability. This is what a community looks like. This is what it feels like when people work together." Applause filled the room, long and heartfelt. Children clapped too, their small hands a reminder of the future everyone was protecting. The feeling in that moment was almost tangible, a mixture of relief, pride, and cautious hope. The old board members faded further into the background. Some moved away quietly, selling their homes, leaving the neighborhood to those who truly cared about it. Others stayed, but were careful to avoid conversations, their influence effectively erased. Their attempts to regain relevance, flyers, whispers, even minor intimidation, had no effect. The community had seen through them, and the lessons learned were not easily forgotten. The transformation was not only physical, but social. Block parties returned, but this time with a new energy. Neighbors who had once barely waved to each other now shared meals, stories, and plans for further improvements. Decisions about the neighborhood were discussed openly, in forums where everyone could participate. The bonds of trust, which had been broken by secrecy and greed, began to rebuild slowly but surely. And yet, there was a sober undertone to these victories. Everyone remembered the long months of frustration, The ignored complaints, the misuse of funds, the betrayal of trust. Those memories served as a reminder. Vigilance was necessary. Complacency could allow corruption to creep back in. Meetings, committees, audits. These were no longer optional. They were essential. The new board instituted monthly reports, regular homeowner surveys, and a clear system for approving all expenditures. Each decision was documented and published. No longer could funds disappear into private accounts or lavish parties. The Albais era of secrecy had ended. In quiet moments, residents reflected on what had been lost and what had been regained. Children laughed in the freshly repaired pool, families walked safely on the new sidewalks, and neighbors gathered in gardens that they had helped plant. But more than that, the community had rediscovered its voice, its strength, and its unity. They had seen how easily power could be abused, and they had learned that only collective action could prevent it. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Mr. Reynolds, the father who had once worried about sustaining participation, sat on his porch watching his children play. "We almost lost this place," he said quietly to Mrs. Ortega, who sat beside him. "But we didn't. We fought. We stayed involved. And now, look at it. Look at them. Look at all of us." Mrs. Ortega smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the sunset. "We didn't just fix the pool or the sidewalks," she said. "We fixed something deeper. We fixed ourselves, as a community. That's something no old board, no amount of misused funds, can ever take away again." And, as the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, casting a warm glow across repaired streets and freshly painted fences, there was a sense of finality. The shadow of the old board had been banished, but more importantly, the spirit of the community had been rekindled. The homeowners had reclaimed not only their funds and their neighborhood, but also their pride, their trust in one another, and the certainty that when they stood together, nothing could break them. The story of corruption, betrayal, and secrecy had come to an end. In its place rose a new chapter, one of transparency, accountability, and hope. A neighborhood reborn, stronger than ever, ready to face the future, together. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories.